Ronan Wordsworth.
And I'm Juan Francisco Muñoz, and this is the Geopolitical Pickle.
Disinformation is all around us. It's hard to go on social media these days without being inundated with people trying to manipulate our points of view using a variety of different tricks. That's why we thought it was essential to bring this series to air and explain the risks and the potential remedies against disinformation.
Disinformation Project is a 5-episode podcast where we will be exploring, with experts in the field, the effects of disinformation in the African continent, as well as its development and what are the tools used to spread this disinformation. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoy the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Disinfo series. Today we're joined by Susan Conrad. She's a policy advisor for rule of law and security in Sub-Saharan Africa for the Konrad and Adenauer Stiftung in Germany. Hello Susan, how are you?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you.
Susan was also a participant as a speaker in the seminar A Surge of Disinformation Across Africa, which was hosted by the Masters in Geopolitics of Charles University in Prague with the sponsorship of NATO. We streamed it in our channel, so if you want to see the full seminar, check our YouTube for the recording. First of all, Susan, we're making this question to all of the interviewees. What is disinformation for you? How do you understand disinformation?
All right, actually, we are starting, I see, with the tough question. So I'm not that kind of expert going into the terminology of disinformation, but when I look to the Russian disinformation campaigns against the West in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think it has a lot to do with deception. So when you're asking me what is disinformation campaign for you, then I would say it's most of all it's a deception campaign, and it has a lot to do with media manipulation tactics and also with strategic deceptions. And the most important thing is as well, it's not just coming randomly out of the blue. It's very much an organized, orchestrated plot. I think this is disinformation for me.
Fantastic. I think, as you said, this is not coming necessarily out of the blue, but as part of a wider strategy potentially of different countries. And I want to start with Russia and go back to some of the historical role over the last decade, I guess, that has seen Russia move into Africa, what sort of positions they've taken, where they started, and how it's evolved into their position on the continent at the moment.
So actually, when we are talking about the Russian influence, everybody is looking to the Sahel region, right? When you look to Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, you see a lot is coming out at the moment because of the Russian influence. But what is going on in the Sahel region has another past, and this past is happening in the Central African Republic some years ago. So we have to go back in former times, nearly 7-8 years, so at the end of 2016, at beginning of 2017. And what the Russians did, and especially Yevgeny Prigozhin with his company Concord, he entered with his company the Central African Republic, and it happened because Russia got approval for arms and weapons to bring it to the Central African Republic. They got an approval by the United Nations Security Council, and they've been not very much looking into the detail what could get out of this Russian influence in the car. So Russia was allowed to send arms and weapons at the beginning of 2017 to the Central African Republic. And with these arms and weapons, also so-called trainers came to the country as well. And what then happened is that the Wagner structures are started to establish this nowadays well-known structure. So they started with the paramilitary branch, which we have as the Wagner actors, for sure, that they're very, very famous right now. But the second thing is very much also the propaganda. So they established as well in the Central African Republic a propaganda agency. And thirdly, they've been also establishing a business company, also working in the Central African Republic. So what we do had at this time is we had the three structures. It was implemented, and then they started to work out. And when we look into the media outlet and the media company to that country, it's been a huge disinformation happening against France at this time, but they also established action movies. The most famous one is so-called Jewist, but they've been also very much into movies for children. So you had some comics One is called The Lions and the Bears. So you see, it's very much advanced approach of disinformation. It's not just about media outlet and news. It's getting into cinemas, into movies. So what people very much looking and thinking what could be of interest for them. And what then happened is that Russia took this plot of information and put it via Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And now they started again to figure out what is productive, what is working, what is not working. So in the end, what we see right now when we look to Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, first of all, they established their own alliance. And with this own alliance, they established also a new media space. And within this media space, Russia has a lot of influence right now. And also what happened with the Alliance des États du Sahel, so this is the alliance, that countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, they started out to kick out the French agencies and all other media agencies and implementing the Russian thoughts and thinking, what they have to think and what they have to spread out in the country. So we do have nowadays also agencies like in the Central African Republic in Mali and also in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso.
And can we say that these campaigns coming from Russia through Wagner have been successful? Because it is perceived as now these disinformation campaigns or the approach that Russia was taking in Central African Republic before and now in the Sahel and in other countries in Africa. Sometimes we don't know how exaggerated it is their success or not.
Well, I mean, when we are going right now into the Sahel region, also maybe it's worth to take a look back. 3 years ago, we do had a lot of Western stabilization instruments in the Sahel region. So I've been talking about MINUSMA, for example, so the United Nations peacekeeping mission. We do had a lot of stabilization mechanisms by the European Union. So the training mission in Mali, for example, but also the capability mission as well in Niger, for example. 3 years later, today, 2024, everything is gone. Of course, not everything has to do with the Russian influence as well, because the Western approach on stabilizing the Sahel region is very much failing. And actually, we talked also about in the conference about the reasons. But one of the main factors pulling out the west of the Sahel region, that's been for sure the Russian influence based on Russian disinformation campaigns against the West. And I take just one example. When we are talking about France established as well a counterterrorism operation. It's called Barkhane in Mali. It's been in the very northern part of Mali. And there's a famous story about the withdrawal of Barkhane in April 2022 and the Russian disinformation campaign against this withdrawal. So what happened is that you saw the Twitter account of Barkhane, and they've been announcing that they get out of the country, and the camp of Barkhane is getting over to the Malian forces. So far, so good. 2 days later, what happened is a Twitter account was popping up, letting us know that next to the Barkhane camp, they found a mass grave with a lot of dead bodies. And actually, what happened is that an information space was created that the French troops, or next to the French camp, there is a mass grave, and the French troops are responsible for a massacre or whatever happened so far. So this is this is a very much prominent example how they created very much disinformation campaigns against France. And what happened then is that the first and only thing happened by the French defense forces, that they came back in France 24 and let the public know that this was for sure a disinformation campaign also led by the Russians and followed by the Malian forces. So when you would ask me if the Russians are very much successful with the disinformation campaigns against the West, I can say yes, for sure, but not just against France, but also against the European Union and also against the US. And it's still ongoing.
And on that, I think you said, like, to start there's some efforts of Russia to sort of be in the traditional media space, whether that's through television or radio, but then also onto the social media. Do they tie those two things together? Where do they see maybe the more impact from the disinformation potentially? Is it a combination of the two, or is it more of the effort going through social media, or through, as you said, propaganda, whether that be different comics or movies or things like this?
I think it's a combination. They are not just going into the traditional social media work. They look what could be productive in a country, and then they are starting. And if they see something is working very much effectively, then they use it. So it depends really on the country. So if you have a deeper look into the country, you can see that. But usually it's a mix of everything, because they want to include everybody. So they would like to have maybe the younger generation, but they are maybe going into an older generation. So it's really to get everybody into the mood of this Russian influence that the West, and especially France, is really the bad guy.
And you've mentioned in the beginning Central African Republic. Now we're talking about the Sahel, highlighting that both of them are former French territories, former French colonies. And has this success of disinformation campaigns of Russia been more prominent in former French colonies because of specific reason, or has it also been successful in other former Western colonies?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, the Russians are very much successful in former French colonies. This is what you can see for sure. And it has also something to do with the common history of France and especially also West Africa. So when we talk about the history of both sides, they have really very much in common. But nevertheless, when you look to with a closer approach to the sub-Saharan Africa continent, you see that Russia is taking more and more influence by disinformation campaigns also in other countries. But in Western Africa, it is very much centralized. So most of the disinformation campaigns are running very much in Western Africa. And this has, for sure, something to do with the French past in that region.
I think we've already been now over Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. They've been clearly very successful there. Do we see any other areas potentially in West Africa where there's new campaigns from Russia trying to change the narrative there? I mean, I know that KAS, you guys have the Political Dialogue West Africa, which is in Benin, Togo, and Cote d'Ivoire. Is there? Do you see it with your people on the ground there and this sort of thing?
Well, that's a very good question. So we do have two offices in Abidjan. One is the Security Policy Dialogue West Africa, and the second is the Political Dialogue West Africa. So when I look to Abidjan, what is interesting there is that it's not very much in the public. So, I mean, my colleagues are going around, talking to people. So in the Ivory Coast, it's not that prominent, that Russian influence, and especially also the disinformation campaign. But nevertheless, however, when you look also into research, you see that also Russia is running disinformation campaigns in the Ivory Coast as well. But the thing with the Côte d'Ivoire is that the Côte d'Ivoire has a much more stable, still Western approach than the Sahel countries as Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. So I would also say that Russia, it's not that easy for the Russian influence to get more awareness as well at the Ivory Coast. But there are more and more Russian influence campaigns against the West are also coming to the countries of the Gulf of Guinea, so including Togo and Benin as well.
I mean, even just to add on to that, I think sometimes it can be subtle. I know from my past experience as well, speaking to even university lecturers in Africa, and sometimes they repeat, especially the Russian talking points around the invasion of Ukraine, for instance. I think that's a very much a place where they like to maybe not try to change the political situation within the country itself, but change the perception on the war.
Yes, I mean, this is also one of the main targets, to change also the perception what's going on in the eastern flank of Europe, for sure. And it's very dangerous for Europe, I think, because what we see so far, that's a huge influence in this, and people also taking this. Nah? When you talk about intellectuals, they take it also as granted what the Russians are telling them. So in this sense, also as the West, and especially as the European Union, we have to do more to inform based on facts and figures about what is really going on the eastern flank.
And how then I think we can start talking about what has been the outcome on the ground of these campaigns and these changes. We've already spoken, obviously, about the confirmation of AES and the chain of coups that was happening in the Sahel. We talked about Central African Republic. How has the situation evolved in the ground since these campaigns were successful there?
I mean, as I said before, when you look to this Alliance des États du Sahel, they already started to create their own media space, which is a lot. And also, I mean, there's been also the information about that. Yes, of course, I do have it here. Actually, what also happened is that at the end of September 2024, so some days ago, it was also reported that Wassim Nasr, he's a journalist of France 24, that that there was an investigation against him launched in the countries. And I think you see this is one of the successes also made by the Russians. And the second thing also what the Russians are doing is they are implementing right now so-called cultural agencies, so-called Russian houses. So we are not just talking about a media outlet anymore, but also bringing the language and the Russian culture to the people as well. And it seems it worked, because when you're in the countries or you're talking to people, there is a huge, how to say, there's a huge misunderstanding right now about the role of France in the region, but also about the European Union. And in the sense, Russia succeeded to get the minds, but also the hearts of the people.
I think that's an important point as well, especially like the role we've seen. Obviously, the Central African Republic is the most developed strategy they have. It was the first place where they started this. And now we see multiple of these Russian language centers and different education centers within the Central African Republic. I just want to ask now, like, what is the best maybe approach from different angles to try and limit the success there, to try and actually maybe counter this in some way, whether that's on a state level or on a basically an NGO institutional level, such as KAS? Like, what are the different roles that people have to play to be able to counter this ongoing disinformation effort?
Yes, first of all, I think when we talk about the European Union, or talking about Germany, or even as the West with the US, I think we have to communicate better, because we did this not in the past. And we have not just to learn to better to communicate with countries in the Sahel region, but also listen better to the people, and especially also to the communities, because in this sense, we failed in the past. And also one of the reasons of the Russian successes is that they simply are better in communicating with the people. So first of all, to talk better to the people, also try to listen better what they would like to tell you. And based on a better communication, we have to set up as a European Union also communication strategies and talk more openly about what we're doing on the continent. It's not just China who is establishing infrastructures or something else. The European Union does this since many, many years. But we failed in talk about what we do. So first of all, when we have a development approach and we try to implement this on the continent, what we need very much right now is also a communicative strategy to bring it to the people. Secondly, when we are talking about the diplomatic track, the embassies, we have to train our diplomats also in speaking better and to communicate better, and also using social media tools. So this is not happening for now. So when you look to a Russian embassy or even to a Turkish embassy, everybody in that embassy is able to set up a tweet or something else. When I look to a German embassy, I don't see that so far. So we do have to train as well our diplomatic staff in how to communicate and make it better. And when we are talking about an NGO or an organization like the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and this is what I also did 2 weeks ago, what we did was we did leadership training. So I was part of a young leadership training in Kampala 2 weeks ago with 20 young participants. And I was speaking in front of them about the Russian influence. And what happened is I went into a discussion with the young population. And we had a very much strong discussion, as you can imagine. But what I did was I presented facts and figures. What's really coming out of the counterterrorism approach in Mali and something else. And I told them, this is not my opinion. This is what I got from statistics, and this is facts and figures. Tell me what you think about. And we have to talk more about, in facts and figures, what's really coming out of the Russian approach from the continent. And this is what we are doing not so far.
I think that's 100% right. I think when people see what the actual situation is in these 3 countries in the Sahel, which have turned towards Russia, that the security situation is significantly worsened, it sort of speaks for itself, right? Once you can get that message out to people and get them understanding the development that happens as a direct result of this partnership potentially with Russia. But I think that's all we have time for today. So again, thanks very much for coming on, Suzanne.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I think we have much more to talk about this Russian disinformation, but not just in Africa, but also in Europe and especially in Germany as well. So I hope you're moving on also with this interview approach.
Absolutely we will be, and we will keep trying to develop this series so that people raise the awareness, as you say, and so people can use it as a tool to understand the progression of this Russian disinformation campaigns and how it's affected countries in Africa, but then obviously that can be extrapolated to the wider community as well. So again, thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll catch you next time on a Geopolitical Pickle to wrap up the series on disinformation.
And if you want to have more information about disinformation, you can always check again our episode, our live stream that is recorded on the YouTube channel on the conference Surge of Disinformation in Africa that happened the 27th of September in Charles University in Prague. Thank you very much.